gorgeous night for it. But now we have something very special for you. We've got a couple guests who we're just delighted and honored to have agreed to join us tonight. And let me introduce them to you. First off, let me introduce Professor Douglas North, who is the Spencer T. Olin Professor in Arts and Sciences in the Department of Economics at Washington University in St. Louis, as well as Professor of History and a Fellow of the Center in Political Economy. He was on the faculty of the University of Washington for a number of years and has held visiting chairs at Cambridge and Rice. In 1993, he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize, the Nobel Prize, as they call it, in economics. And he's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served as president of the Economic History Association and the Western Economic Association. His major interest is in the evolution of economies through time and political institutions. The effect of institutions on the development of economies is a major emphasis in his work in both economic history and development, and you've heard his name mentioned again and again over this week. His major books are The Rise of the Western World with R.P. Thomas, The Growth and Welfare in the American Past, Structure and Change in American History, and Institutions, Institutional Change, and Economic Performance, which you were each given earlier today. So we're just delighted that Professor North is here. Let's give him a quick round of applause. Let me introduce our other panelist, Professor Jean Ensminger. She's the Division Chair for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the California Institute of Technology, where she is a professor of anthropology. Her research interests include the new institutional economics, rational choice theory, experimental economics, economic anthropology, and economic development. She's the author of several books, among them Making a Market, the Institutional Transformation of an African Society, and she's been involved in a project that I think was mentioned earlier in the week about cross-cultural experimental work, which is very fascinating. Now she'll be able to tell us something about. Please welcome Jean Ensminger. And our last panelist, unfortunately, has been delayed en route. It's happened to all of us, and we hope he'll be able to join us later on during the session. And so I'll just give him an introduction in absentia. Let's see here. Professor Avner Greif is the Bowman Family Professor in the Humanities and Social Sciences at Stanford University. His research focuses on European economic history, the historical development of economic institutions, their interrelations with political, social, and cultural factors, and their impact on economic growth. He received his PhD in economics from Northwestern University and was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 1998. And so let's just give him a round of applause. And now Professors North and Greif will each speak.
Try Ensminger, not Greif.
Yeah, you'll be phoning in from the plane. They'll each speak for a short period about their work, and then we'll open it up to a question and answer period. So if you will.
Okay. In 1991, the Soviet Union expired. And in 1993, I got the Nobel Prize in Economics. They're related. And their relationship is what you're all concerned with. Because what the Nobel Committee couldn't figure out is how come economics has nothing to say about a society which dominated most of the history of the 20th century, both its rise being one of the most spectacular transformations of a society in history, and its demise, without any outside overt interference, being one of the most spectacular demises in history, all occurring within a period of some 70 years. And so when they looked around at economics, they found that economists really didn't have anything to say about that. Now that's my theme, and that's what I hope you're going to be concerned with. Because what economics and political science and sociology, all the social sciences, until recently have not been concerned with a set of issues that, in my view, they should have been concerned with, and certainly in the last 40 or 50 years should have been, and to some extent now, as I'm going to mention, are becoming concerned. Economic theory was concerned with how you allocate resources amongst scarce ends in a world in which you assumed you had well-developed markets, you had a government that existed but didn't operate, didn't make any difference, and in which you could assume that all the players were informed about all the alternatives. Now, what you and I are concerned with is a world where none of that's true. We're concerned about how you create markets that work well, and how you get somehow societies which don't have any of these things to work better. And that requires a fundamental restructuring of all the social sciences. Not only my discipline, economics, and Jean's discipline, anthropology, and political science. And we're just beginning that. We're on the way. And I gather that's what you've been talking about most of the last week, and since you have two of my favorite people sitting here in the front row, come on, Munger, quit hiding your eyes. You've already got a good introduction to it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to restructure economic, political science and social theory so that it can apply and solve problems in the world we live in. Now to begin with, you've got to recast certain economics and political theory and social theory to address the right questions. Economics wasn't concerned with these questions at all. Now, if you're going to begin to concern yourself with these questions, you've got to go do the following. You've got to say, how do people make choices in the world? That's something economists have always said, except that they had a simple answer to it. They had an answer that said, well, we assume people are rational, that is, they know what the alternatives are, and they know what to do, and they act accordingly. That's a lot of, if you'll excuse an expression I can use in polite society, that's a lot of apple butter. People are ill-informed, they don't know the alternatives, and indeed they're enormously influenced by the cultural heritage of the world that they've grown up in. So they don't have an understanding of where they are or where they've been. So the first part we have to do is we have to explore what cognitive science tells us about how people learn, how they believe, and so on. Then that gets translated into institutions. And then you got to say, who creates the institutions? Well, you start out with political institutions. We've got the political rules of the game are the fundamental rules that determine the way in which society operates. So you got to ask, how do you aggregate choices in the polity? And so that takes you into political science and takes you how well we know in political theory what makes political systems work the way they do, which we very imperfectly understand at this point. Political scientists are great at telling us how the U.S. Congress works, not very good at telling us why, in fact, political systems work the way they do. Then whoever aggregates choices in the political system creates the economic institutions. And that's where we economists come in, because the economic institutions are the property rights structure. But they're more than that. They're not only the property rights structure, but they're also the norms of behavior and so on, which are not just political and economic, but social, which modify the formal rules of the game. So we've got to understand how those get created, why they're of the kind they are, and why they're modified by social norms and so on, which takes us far beyond economics into social theory and into a lot of the area that Jean's been working in, looking at how people make decisions in complex settings. And we've learned, as indeed I hope Jean will tell you, that it's not a world in which we have simple-minded assumptions about people maximizing in their own self-interest, but a complicated world in which fairness, justice, and things like that modify the behavioral assumptions we use in economics. What we're doing, therefore, is we're rebuilding economics and political theory and social theory, and we're doing it. It's a big job. We're a long ways from where we ought to be, but that's what you've all got to do. We've got to rebuild it so we can start to address the questions that are central to it. The questions are central, which are why we have economies that are poorly performing, why it's so difficult to alter them and make them work better. What is it that's a part of the system that makes societies evolve over time? How come some societies, like the United States, have been relatively, what I call adaptively efficient? That is, they've evolved institutions over the last 200 years that have gradually adjusted to make changes in the face of fundamental, novel changes in what they face. Whereas other societies, of which the Soviet Union was a classic case, have failed to adjust and fallen apart. And in between are all the rest of the worlds we look at, which are worlds in which there are societies which more or less adjust. And since I spent a lot of my time in Latin America, you have a world in which you've had stop-and-go development for 200 and some odd years. I mean, look at Latin America. You had societies that evolved after they became independent of Spain and Portugal. Most of them adopted something that looked like the U.S. Constitution because it seemed like a proper sort of formal set of rules that with radically different results. Why were they different? Well, because what makes a society work, what is the fundamental guts of what makes systems work, is not just the formal rules of the game, but informal norms of behavior about which we know a lot less, and the way both formal rules and informal norms are enforced together. They structure the way the game is played. Now think of it, think of it as like in professional sports, and since we're now looking at the football championships of the world in Seoul these days, you can that's football in your terms, not my football, soccer in my terms. But think of the way soccer is played, or football. It's made up of formal rules, informal norms of behavior. You're not supposed to try to kill the opponent or knee him in the groin, which is what was featured in today's newspaper accounts. And enforcement, which means you have referees, rules, umpires, that together try to see that the game is played more or less the way it's intended. It's never played the way intended, of course, because it always pays to get around the rules. But the degree the referees and norms do their job, it's more or less played that way. So what you have is professional sports that are a mixture of opportunistic behavior, ability to take advantage of getting around rules, together with the rules that constrain you, and together with social norms that say that you really shouldn't knee some guy in the groin when you can do so, at least most of the time. Now, all of that is the same way that economies and polities work in the world. They're made up of the same mixture of formal rules, informal norms, and enforcement characteristics that together define the way the game's played. Now, what we want to do is figure out how that game is played. Then we want to figure out how to make it played better in most of the world so that we get the results we want. We're a long ways from that. We're a long, long ways from it. And indeed, to express a discouraging notion in the world today, I think we're farther from it, given the kind of social problems that we confront in today's world than we have been in a long time. We know a lot about what makes societies productive and grow. We know all about productivity sources, and we can recite those for you in terms of what they are. The sources of productivity growth are. The new growth economics gives it all to you in simple form. We don't know how to get it. How to get it means you've got to understand this complex interplay between social, political, and economic change that is at the heart of what we've got to learn to understand. And when we do understand it, then we're going to make some sense out of the world, and we're going to do a lot better. And that's your job. That's all I'm going to say, and Jean's going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to answer any questions you have. We hope.
I'm going to talk very little. Let me say a few words about what sorts of things anthropologists do and what I do in particular. And the two are actually quite different. I'm an anthropologist, and I was asked to talk about why I would be interested in social change. I think it's impossible to be an anthropologist and not be interested in social change. After all, we study human societies, usually in the developing world, and by its very definition, the developing world is developing. Therefore, it's moving in time, as we all are. I've been working in the same society for about 25 years, almost exactly 25 years. And I've been watching and studying how that society has changed over time. I've always been interested in the economic arena, but the specific methods and hopefully theoretical understanding of what I'm trying to do has progressed over time. And I've learned a lot from all these wonderful scholars here. Unfortunately, this marriage of anthropology with economics and this attempt to try to understand what it is in the economy that drives social change and what it is about social relations and culture that has an impact on that is not something, believe it or not, that anthropologists study very much. They did actually more so in the 1970s than they do now. And part of that is a long, long story. Are there any anthropologists in the room? One brave soul? Any sociologists? A couple more, okay. Well, this will be familiar territory to some of you, but as you're probably aware, there's something of an anti-science, anti-generalization revolution that's going on in a lot of the social sciences. It's not just anthropology and sociology, also political science to some extent, and history to a very large degree. These are approaches that don't even necessarily take empirical case studies seriously, but I would go you one further and say that even empirical case studies, to the extent that they are snapshots in time, and I've taken a lot of these snapshots. I've been back and visited the ORMA many, many times over the years. Snapshots don't add up to understanding social change. We need a good theory, and we need to really pick apart the mechanisms and the processes by which societies move through time. And to understand the specifics of the feedback loops and the interaction between what you start with in terms of the local institutions, that is the more informal institutions, and the government institutions, and how those interact with the economic forces, the incentives, the price changes. And I see all kinds of interactions on the ground. I see, for example, the decline of females, or an effort to eradicate female circumcision that's not unrelated to economic processes. I see a drive towards marriage for love as opposed to arranged marriages that clearly is related to young men having their own incomes and therefore being able to make their own decisions as opposed to reacting to the decisions of their father who used to control all of the resources. I would argue that we need to do more in the way of cross-cultural comparisons in a very, very systematic way. And unfortunately, anthropologists have not helped us out in recent years in this regard. Anthropologists typically are sort of Lone Ranger scholars. They go off to the bush, they study their society. They often do very descriptive studies of that society, which also are not particularly useful in terms of their generalizability. And yet, anthropologists are extremely valuable in this enterprise that I think you've been talking about. Because what anthropologists do have is an intricate understanding of how the informal institutions work on the ground. But that knowledge, to a large degree, goes completely wasted and underutilized. Because if it's not informed by any kind of theoretical apparatus when you go out in the field, it's almost as if you're collecting random data points. And it's hard to make any sense of it in any useful sort of way. We can try to go through and read those ethnographies and put the pieces together, but a lot of it's guesswork. What some of us are trying to do in a project that just started a few years ago is to systematically, in a fairly rigorous way, try to use exactly the same methods in different societies, across different societies. And the particular project that we're involved in, but I would hope that it could be a model of other kinds of investigations, The particular project that we're involved in is actually an experimental economic project where we're trying to get a handle on measures of things like altruism, like cooperation, like trust. You read a lot about this in the development literature. These are supposed to be some critical variables in terms of explaining economic development. But we know very little systematically about how they vary cross-culturally, what the evolution of those social norms and values has been over time. And that's something that we can't get from snapshots that aren't coordinated. We need to have very systematic and rigorous methods that we use cross-culturally. I can tell you, having just spent 6 months trying to revise the protocols and instructions for how you do this cross-culturally, that it is immensely difficult. If you try to imagine how you're going to design anything that's going to work in New Guinea, in Latin America, Africa, it's virtually impossible. I say virtually impossible. I almost abandoned ship in the middle of this exercise in this spring. But we didn't give up, and I'm very, very grateful that we didn't, because we've now come up with a set of protocols that I think is actually going to work. It's not going to work perfectly. We don't run these experiments the same way they do in laboratories. But all that means is that we have more noise in our data, and if we wind up with anything interesting and statistically significant, it's presumably even more powerful if we could get the rest of the noise out of the picture. We hope through this process to get a better understanding of many of the things that Doug was just talking about, to get an understanding of the impact of institutions on a number of these variables, like altruism and cooperation and trust. We hope to understand better the role of economic incentives in behavior. And we hope fundamentally to get a better handle on the evolution of specific social norms and behavioral norms over time. We've structured our data set to include a range of societies from pure hunter-gatherers through slash-and-burn horticulturalists, pastoral nomads, cash crop farmers, and ultimately the industrial US. I will stop there, and I think the intent is to take questions.
Good.
Okay?
Now, Jean and I are going to sit up here, and we are ready to entertain any question you can ask. We don't agree to answer any question you ask, but we'll try. So go ahead. Who wants to ask any questions?
You sitting or standing there?
I'm going to sit in a minute, but I want to get a question out before I if I don't get a question out, I'm going to point at somebody and make them answer the question. So you better be careful. I'm pretty mean about things like this.
I'll give you a hint. There are things we disagree on.
We've been arguing for the last 15 years, so we've got a lot of time to do it. Nobody wants to?
Got one in the back. Yeah.
I had a question about thinking about designing comparative.
You got to speak loud enough so I can hear you.
Okay. I have a question about thinking about the design of comparative research projects, and so in terms of trying to compare altruism, cooperation, and trust across these different societies, with societies at such different levels of development,
Right.
What were the hardest problems that you encountered, and how did you work through those problems, or which ones have not yet been worked through?
Well, we're actually starting round 2 of this project. So we know what we did wrong the first time around, and we're trying to revise it and make it better the second time around. I mean, just to give you an idea, are you vaguely familiar, most of you, with experimental economic methods, the notion of running economic games to look at these sorts of things, dictator games, ultimatum games? Some are, some aren't. Okay, well, let me just explain one of the most simple games. You bring a group of people together, and they're going to play a game with 2 people. You endow one player with, let's say, $100. And you tell them, you're playing a game with somebody in this room, but you don't know which specific individual you're playing with. You tell me how to divide the money with your partner, and I will pay off that partner. That's a very simple game. You can run away with all the money, and nobody but the experimenter will know. And if it's double blind, even the experimenter doesn't know. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, what sorts of problems did we run into? Well, to give you a perfect example, in some of the societies, you couldn't get a group of people together because they lived very dispersed. So one guy went door to door and played the game that way. Now, you explain these results to a psychologist and they say, wait a minute, if they're in the room together face to face, that's going to make a difference in how they play the game. That's just one simple example of the problems we had trying to get the controls tight. The way we've dealt with that issue is that we've eliminated those societies. So we do have data points from one society like that, but that's actually relatively rare. Most people are able to get people together in one room. But those are the kinds of things. We controlled the stakes across societies to be equivalent to 1 day's minimum wage. Well, what does that mean in a society where we know what the minimum wage would be if there was work, but there's hardly ever work? So these are the kinds of issues that we're struggling with. Then there are the problems of translation. Words translate very differently into different languages. We usually accommodate that with back translation. So we have a formal script. It's translated into the local language by one native speaker who has no idea what the heck is going on, and boy, do they look curious when they see this thing for the first time. We get his native language transcript, give it to another bilingual speaker, ask them to translate it back into English. And then we can see where the problems are. And usually it's 2 or 3 words are the problems. And then we have a discussion about what's really trying to be conveyed, correct the script, and then run it by some other people. So those are the kinds of issues that we deal with. We had other problems that are completely inexcusable the first time around, where people just didn't stick to the rules. Those were just, people who goofed up. But the kinds of things that I've described are actually issues that no matter how hard you try, we may not be able to solve all of these problems.
But let me add on a positive note, since Jean gave you all the problems. What we're missing in social sciences is good empirical research. Now we don't have a way, we don't have laboratories like we do in the physical sciences, so we're stuck with various very imperfect ways to try to get information about how do people behave in various settings. Now, what we've done typically in economics and political science is develop elaborate structures and look historically at how people have behaved given the historical evidence. Now, experimental economics has moved beyond this to a step in which we've taken typically students and graduate students in American universities and tried out real games on them along the lines of the ultimatum game that Jean described. That's a step in the right direction because it's an attempt to get down to bedrock about a very fundamental dilemma, because we don't have the ability to be able to have the kind of controlled experiments that we can do in the physical sciences. Now, what is a big development from Jean's world is that most of the work we've done on experimental economics, and I'm on the board of directors of Vernon Smith's group that does experimental economics at George Mason, what we've done is with mostly American students. And I'd always been critical of this because I said, really we want to know how different cultures make a difference in how people respond to the incentive structure. So we took a lot of the game structure, that ultimatum games, dictator games, and other games that we've been devising. And then what we're doing is what Jean talked about, which is to take and try them in a variety of different societies with different cultures and see how different the results were. It's very imperfect, and you asked the right question, because it is criticized by people who would like to say, well, it's not a perfect laboratory experiment, and indeed it's an artificial setting and all the things that we know about. But what we tried to do is try to make it as carefully done as possible, and Jean's group has started out, and she just described this, very crudely doing it, and then gradually has refined the technique, so we're trying to get most of the problems out of it so that we can begin to get some meaningful results. And I think it's on the way to being something very exciting. Wow, I got almost more than I can do. You're next.
It occurs to me that
That's you, yeah.
it occurs to me that one of the things that sort of if you're trying to study norms is that these are things that evolve in response to repeated situations, and so it seems to me that what very often the kind of decision a group of people will make facing a unique situation for the first time in a quasi laboratory like setting will be very different from the kind of behaviors that they will develop, facing a problem repeatedly over long periods of time, and then kind of having rules emerge. Is that?
I have to take this question. I love it.
And then after she gets it, I'm going to tell you what's wrong with her answer.
Okay, number one, we have lots and lots of evidence that people don't obliterate their mind when they come into the laboratory. And it's not a laboratory, of course, it's a village. So when they come in to play the game, usually what they're doing, and the psychologists would back us up on this, is they look at the game and they think, now what does that remind me of? And whatever that cues, that's what behavior is invoked in the context of the game. Now, there are, of course, games that are played repeatedly. But we specifically want one-shot games for logistical reasons as well as other reasons. And it's our best hope, actually, of picking up whatever it is that people are cueing. I'll give you one quick example. When I played the public goods game with the Orma, public goods is sort of, the context is you can contribute to the common pot, which is defined as something like a community development project. When the Orma play that game, they come out of it and they refer to it as the Harambe game, which is their local institution of building public goods. It's never referred to by me as the Harambe game, but they make that association. And there are also some interesting demographics in terms of how people play the game that are very consistent with the way they are in real life. Now that's a one-shot game. Why don't they all just contribute nothing to the pot and they still get their payoff in the end? In other words, why doesn't everybody free ride? And they don't. And they play many of our games in predictable ways that have to do with certain things locally. However, there's some exceptions to that. And you said, what does this have to do with real life? It's such an unusual situation. I'll give you one example that, well, this is kind of the punchline of our whole project, which is that across 16 societies, the most generous, the most altruistic people in the dictator game that I described, and this runs all the way across the societies, it's not just sort of them and everybody else, is the US. The US is the most generous, the most altruistic, and it goes from the hunter and gatherers right straight through the line. It's quite a highly statistically significant relationship across 16 societies. Now this is counterintuitive. The greedy capitalists and their close relatives wind up being the most fair-minded in the dictator game. Now, you may say, yeah, wait a minute. From what I know about hunter-gatherers, they share meat. And it's true, they share meat. So those guys down at the bottom who are playing very greedily in the dictator game, but in their real life, when they bring home the bacon, so to speak, they share it around in the community. So you could say, well, these results are completely meaningless. Are they? Or have we actually structured in this game something that might tell us something about how people approach novel economic opportunities? In other words, maybe this is a better way to look at how people would respond to a new alternative that entered into their landscape, and therefore can tell us more about economic development than the specifics of a meat-sharing exercise, which, bear in mind, is a highly contextualized, explicitly defined, and enforced exercise. What we're learning, I think, in the games is that principle of generosity and sharing does not get generalized beyond the bounds of that specific exercise. And there's a lot of ethnographic material that would reinforce that, talking about donor fatigue and how people will cheat when they can get away with it. If they slaughter a game in the bush, they'll eat it and consume it privately. They're not allowed to do that if they bring it back into the village. If you introduce trousers in these societies, people immediately have privatization and cash becomes privatized because it's hidden away in your pocket. So it's really an open question, which tells us more about how people would respond to economic opportunities and incentives.
Wait a minute, you can't get that. I've got to answer all these. I'm not through yet.
I may have to have another word too.
You can get all the words you want. Just a sec. Jean and I wandered the top and bottom of Central Australia last summer together. And we argued from one end of Australia to the other about these issues. It was a good friendly argument. We've been arguing for 15 years, so we've had a lot of practice. I think the experiments are enormously important. And indeed, they are essential clues to our being able to get a handle on pieces of the action. There's a big problem in converting, and this is why your question is so relevant, big problem in converting, and Jean related to this, between static explanations of something at a moment of time and how they evolve over time. And that's what we really don't know. We really don't have a good answer to it, and Jean hinted at some of the answers to it. But for example, let me take, and you're not gonna believe this, but I've sort of halfway come around to agreeing with it.
I noticed it was we involved in these experiments, Doug. This is a change.
And that is, how do we explain something like the fact that, and comes out strongly in the comparative studies of different cultures that they've been doing, that the more market-oriented they are, the more there tends to be cooperative behavior and sharing and things like that that, as Jean said, at least appear as on the surface anomalous. And yet, at the same time, we talk about societies which, and she mentioned this, where at least in very primitive society you had sharing of meat when the hunter goes out and shares it with the rest of the group and so on. Well, one of the things that I think is happening, I think Jean will agree with this, is I think what's happening is that we have one kind of sharing norm that exists in a particular setting where you have a hunter-gatherer society and you've got these things. You have another kind of sharing norm evolving when you evolve a market economy, because that produces a different notion about the gains and costs of cooperative behavior. And I think what's happening is that what happens as you get markets developing is that it develops a sharing norm, and therefore different and maybe much more interesting senses about fairness and justice and moral attitudes than we get with static societies that stick with a hunter-gatherer variety. So we're not as far away as we used to be. I think I hate to say this, because I'm writing a book about all this, and she's got to read it in the next few months. But I think that gradually we're starting to get an understanding of what's a very complicated issue. Okay, next question. Yeah.
Are there any other approaches in social...
Speak louder, I'm deaf.
Okay, are there any other approaches to the study of informal institution in the social sciences? And why did you select the game approach to study informal institution? What was so appealing to you in the game theory to the study of informal institution?
Well, you should answer other approaches to study of informal institutions.
Yeah, you can start now.
Okay. Oh, definitely. The anthropological literature is replete with studies of the informal economy. And it's kind of an old topic that recurs with renewed interest periodically. The Society for Economic Anthropology had a conference and did a volume on it somewhere in the 90s, early 90s, I think. I find most of it pretty much a yawn. We all know there's black markets. We all know there are vendors who stand on the street corners. We all know it's a big part of economies. We know that that's related to transactions costs of getting businesses licensed. But the part that starts getting interesting is the part that the economists have been working on, the understanding of transactions costs and the effect of loss of tax revenues. When you read the anthropological studies, it's kind of these purely descriptive studies. And I'm not sure what we get out of them when you add them all up together. It provides interesting raw data for the people who bring a little bit of theory to it in the form of transactions cost theory. They've got a couple of case studies, more than a couple, that they can look at for mining for raw material. But we could do so much more than that. So why am I attracted to this method? The rigor of this method, I think, is unsurpassed at this point for giving us the tool to look systematically at things cross-culturally. Now, you can't, the more formal the method, the more that gets left out. So there are many things that you can't look at. This isn't going to be the be-all and end-all of everything. But the ability to isolate certain phenomena very precisely is, I think, if we're fortunate, is going to have a profound effect in getting us part of the way towards understanding some of the mechanisms of human behavior. It's not going to be the end of it. But hopefully that will then send the field workers back to the field who have a predilection for doing the detailed case studies and the nuts and bolts stuff. And maybe they suddenly see that there are other things they should be looking at. My reference to the sort of random data points. Unfortunately, that really is how a lot of it is done. When it's not informed by theory, when it's not informed by a framework like this, which tends to shed a very bright light on some areas that wind up being much, much more interesting to look at. in my own research, because I do a lot of that too. I've been doing case studies my entire career. That's what I started in. And now I find that I've got a whole range of new questions that I want to bring to bear on the detailed qualitative and ethnographic case study.
You see, Jean and I started at opposite ends of the pole. We both went the other way. I started out from economics with lots of theory, but no empirical evidence at all. And so I was really fascinated by anthropological studies that at least descriptively told me stories about social norms and behavioral characteristics in other societies. And this was enormously influential upon me, because Jean went the other way. She knew all that stuff, and she went to where we're going now. And now I'm going to come back to what we're doing, because I do think that the future of our getting a handle on this is transaction cost economics. Transaction costs are a way by which we're beginning to try to measure, really, the costs of exchange in settings, and a big part of the costs of exchange are a result not just of the formal institutions, but of informal norms of behavior. And so once we start to do transaction costs and try to measure the costs of making exchange in different sorts of markets, and I urge you, if you come from third world countries, the way you want to start doing research in any third world country is you want to ask yourself, you want to go around and ask yourself, what's the cost of transacting in all kinds of factor and product markets? Just straightforward. And you want to go and measure it. And after you've measured it, then you want to ask, what causes the cost of transacting to be what they are? And that gets you into the institutions that structure and produce that measurement cost. So we're on the right track, and Jean has moved in that direction. I strongly urge you that this is where we've got to go. We've got to get measurement of all these things, and we can do that with measuring transaction costs, and that has enormous promise in getting at a handle on norms and what causes norms to be where they are, because after you measure the formal consequences of various institutions, then you have all the informal norms like honesty and integrity and things like that that show up in various indirect ways that really affect the cost of transacting in different kinds of exchange situations. And so that's where we want to go. So we're sort of in agreement again. Yes?
Do you think that in the long run, experimental economics is going to attempt to quantify cultural values?
Not all cultural values, but there are a few that we can say something about. I mean, it raises the data from the hunters and gatherers and slash and burn horticulturalists who are coming in pretty low on the sharing and altruism raise some very interesting questions. Mind you, this is a question that's been raised by ethnographic anthropologists as well. They actually disagree on this. There are some who see these societies as the ultimate primitive communism, and there are others who say, no, that's not really the way it is at all. So they're kind of, I mean, these are the ethnographers who lived and studied these societies for eons, and they're not in agreement. So I think there's certainly a place for some other method to come in and kick in some data that weigh in on this debate. On that one, I think we can say something. On trust, we can say something. On cooperation, the problem is there are very few games that are conducive to working cross-culturally. They need to be very simple. We're dealing with illiterate populations, innumerate populations, so the games have to be structured incredibly simply. I personally am not very imaginative about inventing these games. Others hopefully will be more so, and invent some more games that we can use. We have a new one in our arsenal this time around, which is going to be very, very interesting, I think. This is the third-party punishment game, which will get at, if it succeeds, if we can get people to do it, to actually get punishment behavior. I'm fascinated to find out who are the guys in societies who will pay a personal price to punish others for violating a social norm. So we have a game structured where if they know how two players have played the dictator game and player one screwed player two, will they pay a part of their stake to punish player one for having behaved badly towards player two? I want to know who those guys are in societies and how are they spread out across the evolutionary continuum. Because those guys presumably are very, very important in terms of getting the economy running. The guys who are prepared to pay a cost to punish.
Remember, you have to speak loud. I'm deaf. She's not deaf, but I'm deaf.
I think that the most unfortunate part with social science is that we cannot do experiments with the whole society. The best we can do is usually that we construct a simplified model or find the most relevant data, for example, and do analysis. If we construct a model, sometimes we simply have a lot of simplified assumptions. And actually, those assumptions does not describe the real world. And if we found some data and examples, and we need to control for a lot of other influences from a lot of other variables we don't want. And so, my question, and some people, because of this, some people comment that social sciences draw their conclusions actually just based on what models they construct and what examples they have found. So I want to know that, what's your comments about this? What do you think about it?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, but I think if I summarize it correctly, I would say, what are the limits to social science theorizing given the constraints that we have as a... okay. And the answer is they're very real. And indeed, Jean's referred to them over and over when we try to do real experiments and experimental work, or in any kind of empirical work. We're stuck with the very serious limitations that we have. But having said that, we've come a fair way. We've done over time a lot of empirical research. We've developed elegant bodies of theory, and we've developed empirical research which with feedback is beginning to give us crude but nevertheless very interesting answers. We're a long ways from where we were 30, 40 years ago. And I say this with some feeling because 30 or 40 years ago, the new institutional economics and all the things that we're interested in here, which is attempting to get at these issues, was something nobody was interested in. Now they are, and because they are, and because we're developing theory, new institutional economics, which is directly focused on asking these questions, we're beginning to get empirical feedback, well, the sort of thing Jean's doing, that is beginning to get us tentative answers. Now, what it doesn't give us good answers to, and what we just were interacting on, it at best gives you answers to a static set of questions. That is, at a moment of time, how do people respond, as Jean's describing, to particular kinds of game theoretic models that ask questions? Or when we do experimental economics, where we try all kind of experimental economics measuring incentive structures in different contexts, which is what Charlie Plott and Vernon Smith and others are doing. None of them give us good answers to the dynamic questions, which is constructing how societies evolve over time. That's the $64 question. We're a long ways from it. We'll never have such elegant body of theory as we like, but we're beginning to develop theory which we think is beginning to get at pieces of that. And as we do, we're going to make better answers to the problems we have. And one of the things that really plague policy issues for third world countries is simply that all of the theory came out of neoclassical economics until very recently. It was all static, and it all gave you answers that were good in a world of static explanations. We realize that's the wrong way to think about it. We've got to think about it in terms of the fact that when you do a policy response, you set in motion a set of changes that occur all the way through the system, and we've got to look at social, political, economic consequences of making an institutional change at one parameter and how that changes everything else along the lines and downstream. We're beginning to do that. We're a long ways from where we have to go, but we're beginning to ask the questions right. But the tough answer is we'll never have the elegant body of theory that, say, physics has. Yeah?
I wonder if we can't use at least in part the information that the multinational companies have. I mean, they work day by day in different environments. They know about formal and informal institutions. They make profits or they lose money there. I think they, when they launch a product in a country, they know many things about that country, particular things.
No, they are a valuable source of information that we're just beginning to mine. And I'm particularly interested because I've met in the last 2 or 3 months with a number of business executives who have been involved in third world countries and have been explicitly concerned with particular kinds of ways by which they're getting changes. And this is something we've got to mind because they've got enormous amounts of empirical knowledge which we've got to get a handle on. We're beginning to do that, but you're right, this is a good source that we haven't really mined properly.
My question is that
Remember to speak loud.
we are dealing with the effort of bridging the distances between different social science traditions. But I know that in institutional economics there's an effort in coping with what cognitive science can give to this project. So I'm asking, which kind of cognitive science do you think is more promising in this framework? And which are the issues that you think cognitive science would need to cope with?
Well, what we'd like out of cognitive science, which we're a long ways from getting yet, and we would like to know how the mind takes new information and processes it and learns from it to modify, therefore, the initial preconceptions that the mind had, which is what learning is. Learning is a process of getting evidence from the external world, whether communication evidence or physical evidence, and having that go into the mind and then gradually learning from it. Now what we want to know is what that learning process looks like, what prevents it from being accepted at various times, what leads it to it being spread amongst people effectively, and then when we do that, then we can begin to get a handle on how people make choices. After all, what we know is that people who make choices, the political choices that make a society the way it is, or economic choices, are a result of the way people see the world, belief systems. So we want to go from how the mind interprets the evidence, to how belief systems evolve, to how in turn those get translated into institutions. Now, I'm finishing a book that I'm going to have out at the end of this year. It's going to tell you all the answers to all that question. I'm not going to give it to you now because we won't read my book. But seriously, it's a long ways. But that's where we're going, and that's what I hope we're going to be able to give meaningful answers to. My friend John Nye over here, whom I argue with all the time, doesn't think so far we've gotten very far on this, but he's wrong. He hasn't read my newest chapter.
It'll be wrong too.
Yeah, that's true. It'll be wrong too. You're quite right. You go ahead and call. You call her what it was.
It seems like we've had some good insights into situations where incentives change or costs change, and that results in changes of institutions or norms. But what work is being done on how and when preferences change?
How what change?
Preferences.
Preferences change. It's yours.
Yeah, well, the MacArthur Foundation organized a group to study exactly that about, just got renewed for funding, so it's been 5 or 6 years, I think, called the Preference Network. This is primarily formal theoretical economists who are associated with it, some cognitive scientists, some psychologists, people like George Lowenstein, Colin Kammerer, but it's primarily economists. Colin Kammerer is really an economist too. And there's lots and lots of formal work in economics on preference formation, preference changes. From an anthropological point of view, let me say again, I think anthropologists have contributed very little to this exercise. In part because science is definitely not fashionable these days in anthropology, and whenever you ask a question like that, how does something change, it's pretty hard to go at the problem without employing some kind of serious scientific method. The Cross-Cultural Project is certainly interested in addressing those kinds of questions, but arguably we're going to fail to the degree that we'd like to be able to answer those questions. It's certainly a very good one. The problem is, of course, we're going to have a bunch of snapshots, and to get at the actual processes, that's where you probably want to marry that with the intensive case study and watch how these things change on the ground over time. I've done a little bit of that as I've looked also at social norms, how social norms have changed among the Orma over time. But it's a good argument for why we need both. We really need both, and we need both going through the same minds, not a pack of anthropologists over here sitting doing their thing, uninformed by the theory, and a bunch of economists spewing out mathematical formulae without having a sense of what's going on the ground. And I mean, this is basically my argument here, which is that we're missing huge opportunities by not getting more of these exchanges going.
I want to add one point to it. It seems to me that we're going to the road to our understanding more about preference. Oh, here comes our third member. He can answer all the questions from now on who we haven't been able to answer. Avner Greif is walking down the floor, and it's going to be all his.
I came late because I knew that Doug would want me to do everything, and
Well,
I has the excuse that I don't have the time.
What I want to talk briefly about with respect to preference, one of the interesting areas that I'm very interested in these days is dealing with a problem that most cognitive scientists in the world and philosophers try to avoid, which is the problem of human consciousness. And the reason why this is interesting is because almost all of the ills and benefits of the human mind come out of consciousness. The things that make us be imaginative, creative, and so on come out of consciousness, as well as all the prejudices, dogmas, and so on also come out of it. And so one of the things that we're trying to understand is how consciousness changes over time with different experiences. Now, we should be interested in this for very good reason. Because if we're interested in something like what happened in 9/11 or anything like that, we're interested in how belief systems evolve with different experiences in different settings, and this is a function of the way in which consciousness responds to these things. So we're beginning to deal with these issues. We're a long ways from it, and indeed we should be doing much more on it because it's crucial for our survival. Now with that, now that Avner's here, you can go and ask any question. We'll turn them all over to Avner from now on. Yeah.
I have two questions on experimental economics, and I think experimental economics works pretty well on microeconomics. Like most of the games are related with game theory, but how about the experimental economics? These experiments work on macroeconomics, because I don't think you can create a game like if you want to know how the central bank affects the economy, and how can you get a game to like represent such a game? And also, if you want to detect like the effect of the Great Depression, how can you create an environment that exactly represents the economic environment in Great Depression? And the second question is,
wait a minute, you've got one's enough for a minute. Let's deal with this one first, buddy, because that's a big question. Because how good macroeconomics, broadly conceived, is a big problem. Frankly, I conceive of most macroeconomics as being astrology.
Well,
I haven't finished yet.
I was just going to support you on that.
The reason is that a good macroeconomics is going to have to involve all the things we've talked about earlier. It's going to have to involve political theory and social theory, particularly political theory. You can't make any sense out of macroeconomics without being concerned about the polity and how it integrates with how an economy works. That's the heart of what makes economies, any modern economy, and even not so modern economies work. So we haven't begun to do the kind of modeling process that we have, but we're beginning to do that. And I hope maybe Avner will have something to say about it, but first Jean will have something to say about it.
I'll just say, I come from Caltech, where we have a very good economics department, and we have 0 macroeconomists. So that